Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
When Mom stood at the head of the long oak table that night, her silver hair sprayed and sculpted into that tight curl she always wore for occasions she deemed important, she held her wine glass like a scepter and looked right past me, her firstborn, and smiled directly at my younger brother and sister as if the last 4 decades had been some kind of game show I never knew I was losing. The worst part? I wasn't surprised. Not even a little. See, my mother has always had a way of twisting love into currency and expectation into chains. Growing up in a middle-class house with walls thinner than anyone's patience, I learned early that if you wanted affection from Mom, it had to be earned by being louder, shinier, needier, or frankly, just more of what she liked. And I wasn't. I was quiet. I watched. I took in everything she said, every way she praised Jake for simply existing or cooed over Laura's latest hairstyle like it cured cancer. I stopped trying to compete before I turned 10. But that didn't mean I didn't remember. I remembered everything. My father, God rest him, was the only buffer between us. He was never much of a talker, a Vietnam vet who kept his stories locked in the back of his eyes, but he had a way of grounding the room when Mom would start one of her "let me tell you what real sacrifice looks like" monologues. He saw me. Maybe not with big gestures or loud words, but in quiet things, a late-night snack left out when I studied, a ride to a friend's house when I didn't want to explain why I couldn't ask Mom. He was the only reason I didn't pack a bag and vanish after high school like I dreamed of so many nights. But the thing about a buffer is, when it's gone, the pressure builds fast. And when Dad got sick slowly, cruelly, the kind of illness that takes more from the family than from the body, you could feel the shift. Mom clung to Jake like he was her lifeline and leaned on Laura like her shadow. And me? I was logistics. I was the nurse, the bill payer, the one who made sure Dad's morphine came on time and that the paperwork didn't pile up. She called me reliable, and I knew it was code for unimportant. I did what needed to be done, and in Mom's eyes, that made me invisible. I used to wonder why it bothered me so much, even after all those years. I mean, I had built a life for myself, good job, stable marriage, 2 kids who liked being around me. But whenever we came back for holidays, I could feel myself shrinking into that same 10-year-old girl with hands too clean and voice too soft. My husband had noticed. He always did. He'd squeeze my knee under the table or give me that sideways glance that said, "You don't have to prove anything here." And maybe I didn't, but I wanted to. God help me, I still wanted her to say "I see you." Which brings me to the dinner. The legacy dinner, as she called it in the invitation. Handwritten. Embossed. No detail too small for Linda Carter. It was 2 weeks after the 1-year anniversary of Dad's passing, and she told us she wanted to honor his wishes and talk about what would happen with the family home and the land. Now, the house wasn't a mansion, just an old 2-story with a wraparound porch and the kind of creaky stairs that had rhythm to them, but the land? 40 acres of woods and pasture in Northern Virginia. Prime development property now. Worth 7 figures, easily. And to her, it was more than dirt, it was legacy. Proof that the Carters were worth something. The moment I got that card in the mail, I knew what was coming. I could smell the manipulation on the paper. But I went. Not because I wanted anything. I didn't. What I wanted had never been for sale. But something inside me, maybe pride, maybe something darker, told me this was the last time I'd sit quietly while she told the world who mattered and who didn't. When we arrived that night, she was already glowing like a debutante, kissing the air around Laura's cheek, clinging to Jake's arm like a prom date. The table was set with the good china, Dad's side of the family, if anyone still remembered, and the wine was flowing like water. I stayed sober. I always do at these things. Not because I can't drink, but because I need to be clear-headed when Mom's doing her theater. She had placed name cards at each seat. Jake at her right, Laura at her left, me 3 chairs down, between a potted fern and the window. Subtle as ever. She waited until dessert, naturally, when the creme brulee came out and the lights were dimmed just enough to make everyone look soft around the edges. Then she stood up, tapped her glass with a spoon like we were at a wedding, and launched into the speech. I won't lie, I zoned out at first. I'd heard it all before. The sacrifices she made, how much she gave up to raise us, how she never got to chase her dreams because she chose motherhood. As if we begged her to. But then came the words that made my stomach twist. "I want a toast," she said, pausing for effect, "to the children who truly deserve my legacy." She smiled then. Not a warm smile. A knowing smile. A smile with edges. And she looked straight at Jake and Laura while raising her glass, her back to me. I didn't flinch. I let her have the moment. What she didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that I had a pen in my purse. A very specific pen. And in my car, waiting in a sealed envelope, were the papers that would change everything. The ink was dry. The signatures were legal. The property she thought she controlled had already changed hands. And not to Jake. Not to Laura. To me. But I let her finish her toast anyway. Because some endings are better when they feel like victories right before they fall apart. And I know what you're thinking right now. Was it revenge? Was it petty? Was it right? Let me ask you this. Have you ever watched someone rob you of love your whole life and then expect you to thank them for the crumbs they left behind? Would you have done it? Let me tell you what happened next. Because this story is just getting started. The house smelled the same as always, roast beef slow cooking in the oven, a little too much potpourri in the hallway, and that faint scent of lemon furniture polish that clung to every surface like a performance. Like she needed the house to smell clean enough to distract from how many things were rotten underneath. I hadn't been inside in nearly a year, not since we spread Dad's ashes in the little clearing out back where the grass grew differently, thicker, as if even the ground had decided to protect what little of him was left. Walking through the front door that evening felt less like entering a home and more like stepping onto a stage that had been built long ago for a play I never auditioned for, but had been cast in since birth. She greeted us at the door like we were guests in a country club lounge she owned, wearing that pearl-colored blouse she always reserved for elegant affairs, with her makeup precise, lips painted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Rachel, look at you," she said in a tone that always felt like the first few notes of a critique dressed as a compliment. "You've lost weight, haven't you? I hope everything's all right." That was Linda Carter's specialty, worry weaponized, turned into a judgment thinly veiled as concern. I didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't give her the satisfaction. I just stepped in, nodded, and said, "Dinner smells good, Mom," and moved past her. Jake was already on his second glass of red wine, lounging in the living room with the kind of relaxed confidence only the beloved son of a narcissist can possess, while Laura flitted between the dining table and the kitchen, making herself useful in the way she always did when she wanted to be noticed, adjusting silverware, refolding napkins, laughing too loudly at things that weren't funny. It was a scene I'd walked into 1,000 times before, but this time, something in me was different. There was a calmness under my skin, not the usual quiet resentment or sadness, but something still and solid, like stone. I watched as my mother glided between her children like a hostess preparing for a gala, ensuring everything looked perfect, everyone was smiling, everyone remembered who she wanted to be that night. She avoided eye contact with me, except in short, darting glances, as if checking to make sure I hadn't shown up with bad manners or, worse, a spine. The dining room had been redressed with fresh flowers, the family photos rearranged on the wall to highlight Jake's graduation, Laura's engagement, that cruise they all took without me 5 years ago. My wedding photo was there too, just barely visible behind a vase of orchids, as if it had wandered into the frame by mistake. The meal itself was elaborate, as expected. 4 courses, each one punctuated by little speeches from Mom about how she made the stuffing just like Dad liked it, or how the green beans were handpicked from the co-op because only fresh tastes like real food. She paused at certain dishes to recall stories that featured Laura's helpfulness or Jake's childhood jokes, while I passed plates and smiled politely, each story digging just a little deeper into a wound I thought I had already let scar over. But I didn't interrupt. I had no interest in changing the narrative she clung to. I knew the truth, and more importantly, I knew what was coming. After dessert, as the sky outside shifted from dusk to deep navy and the crickets began their usual chorus beyond the screened-in porch, she stood. No one asked her to, of course, but that had never stopped her before. She tapped her spoon against her glass with that theatrical flair she reserved for these kinds of moments, the kind of tap that wasn't casual or accidental, but deliberate and demanding. The room quieted, eyes turned to her as if by instinct, and she cleared her throat in that well-rehearsed way that signaled she was about to say something important. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice measured, almost reverent. "It's not just another Sunday dinner, as I'm sure you've guessed. It's been a difficult year, losing your father, but it's also reminded me of how precious family really is. And more than anything, it's reminded me who we can count on when things fall apart." There was a pause, brief but weighted, a silence that stretched just long enough for everyone to feel the shape of what she was implying. I didn't blink. I didn't even shift in my chair. She continued, eyes shimmering with that artificial mist she conjured up whenever she wanted to appear moved. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. About what we leave behind, and to whom. And tonight, I want to raise a toast." She lifted her glass slowly, deliberately. "To the children who truly deserve my legacy. To the ones who were there when it counted, who made me proud, who reminded me what family should look like." I watched her hand tremble slightly, just enough to make her seem vulnerable, just enough to sell the lie. She turned her gaze toward Jake, then Laura, her eyes lingering just long enough to confirm the intended meaning. My brother smirked, lifted his glass with an air of smug gratitude. Laura, ever the actress, wiped an invisible tear from the corner of her eye and whispered, "Thank you, Mom," like she had just won a scholarship. I let her finish. I didn't stop her when she turned back to the table, smiling like a queen bestowing knighthood on her most loyal subjects. I didn't speak. I didn't raise my voice or call her out. I didn't need to, because I had already won, long before she ever stood up. The pieces had been moving for months, quietly, without drama or confrontation. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they were out posing for pictures and planning vacations, I had been sitting with Dad during his final months, talking with lawyers, gathering signatures, making sure that when the dust settled, the truth would be carved in ink and law, not in toasts and theatrics. And as I reached into my purse and felt the cool edge of the pen I brought just for this occasion, I realized something. Revenge doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it's just being the last one to speak. But I waited. Not yet. The moment wasn't ready. Because when the pen came out, I wanted them all watching. And that moment, was still just ahead. If you'd asked my mother, back when Dad was still breathing without assistance and Jake still hadn't defaulted on his second mortgage, who would inherit the house she walked through every morning like a monarch inspecting her territory, she would have said, with the kind of blind certainty only the self-deluded possess, that it would stay in the right hands, by which she meant her hands, followed eventually by Jake's, naturally, because he was the man of the family now, a ridiculous title she started tossing around the week after Dad's funeral as if it carried legal weight, as if manhood were something Jake had earned through anything other than being born male and loud. But what Linda Carter didn't know, and what made every one of her carefully crafted speeches all the more satisfying to sit through in silence, was that 6 months before Dad took his last breath, when the world around him had already started slipping through the cracks in his memory, he called me into the den one night while the rest of them were watching TV and asked me quietly, plainly, without ceremony, if I had a pen. I remember the moment exactly, not just because of what followed, but because of how calm he was, how his voice sounded like the version of him I thought I'd lost to the painkillers and the endless calendar of chemo. He was sitting in his old recliner, the leather cracked and warm, a blanket pulled over his knees, and he said, "Rachel, come sit," like he had something simple to ask, like he was about to hand me a grocery list. I sat down across from him, notebook in hand, because I thought he wanted help remembering something again, an appointment, a name, the dosage of a pill, but instead, he pulled out a manila envelope, already sealed on 3 sides, and said, "This is the new agreement. I don't want your mother touching the property after I'm gone. I want you to sign it with me. Not Jake. Not Laura. You." You've earned it. Now, I'm not naive. I knew that in most families, that would be an impossible conversation, maybe even a cruel one. But in ours, in that room, it felt less like an ambush and more like a rescue. He knew what she was, maybe not in all the academic, psychological terms we throw around now, but in the way a man comes to understand the quiet tyrannies of a woman he's spent 40 years trying to please. And in his own way, this was his apology for not protecting me more, for not stepping in sooner, for letting her shape the house into a theater of hierarchy where love had to be begged for and obedience was rewarded with crumbs. This was his way of giving me a weapon, not to hurt them, but to survive them. So I signed. Not out of greed. Not because I cared about land or titles or even the money it could bring. I signed because for once in my life, I had been seen by someone who mattered. Noticed. Trusted. And I wasn't going to waste that. The documents were clean, legally binding, drawn up with the help of Dad's old army buddy, a semi-retired estate lawyer who owed him a favor and didn't much care for Linda, if I'm being honest. It was all done quietly, power of attorney, property transfer upon death, the kind of paperwork that people like my mother assume only ever exists inside their control. And I kept it hidden, tucked away in a safe deposit box, with copies locked in my own home, filed under a name she wouldn't think to search. For nearly a year, I said nothing. I attended every birthday, every holiday, every fake smile brunch, never flinching, never correcting her when she talked about her land or Jake's future. Let her dream. Let her build the castle in her mind. I didn't owe her the truth until it was time. What made it even more surreal was that she truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect ending. She believed that by shuffling Dad's will through her own lawyer and filing it with language as vague as family use and shared understanding, she had left no cracks, no way for anything to slip through. But she didn't know about the revised addendum. She didn't know that Dad had revoked the outdated terms 2 months before he passed, slipping them quietly into the hands of a notary who came by under the pretense of checking on the new oxygen machine. She didn't know that every time she prattled on about the legacy she'd built, she was standing in a house that no longer legally belonged to her. I never told Ed either. Not right away. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed it to be mine. For once. Mine alone. He saw the change in me, though, the way I walked a little taller, the way I no longer clenched my jaw when Mom's number appeared on my phone. He never pressed, never pried, just said, "Whatever it is, you've earned it," and that was enough. The night before the dinner, I pulled the envelope from the safe and read it one more time, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel it tangibly, undeniably. The weight of it in my hands felt like justice. Not revenge. Not spite. Just a balance, finally restored. I packed the pen carefully, the one Dad always used for checks, still half full of ink. I knew Mom would toast something. I knew she'd perform. I didn't know the exact words she'd use, but I knew the shape of them, self-congratulatory, sentimental, designed to wound. And I wanted to be ready. That pen wasn't just ink and metal. It was the end of pretending. The end of enduring. It was the full stop at the end of a sentence I'd been writing for over 40 years. And the next time she made me feel small in front of her precious audience, I was going to sign my name so quietly, so deliberately, that she wouldn't even hear the sound of her power disappearing until it was already gone. There is a particular kind of silence that takes over a room when someone has just said something they truly believe will be remembered for generations, an uncomfortable stillness that doesn't feel reverent or awestruck, but rather like the pause after someone slipped on stage and you're not sure whether to laugh or pretend it didn't happen, and that was exactly the atmosphere around the table after my mother's toast. She was still holding her wine glass up, her elbow slightly bent in that forced, elegant pose she had likely rehearsed in front of a mirror a dozen times earlier that day, waiting for applause or a round of warm affirmations from her children. Fully unaware that the very foundation she stood on was already gone, quietly dissolved beneath her, and that the smile I wore was not one of approval but quiet anticipation. Jake, of course, took the bait first. He always does. With his easy charm and that smug little grin he's been wearing since high school, He raised his glass just high enough to meet hers and added some offhand comment about how it's an honor to carry the torch, as if inheriting property was the same as being knighted for bravery. Laura followed a second later, misty-eyed and breathless, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic as she whispered something about how she'd always known Mom valued their loyalty and how proud Dad would have been of this beautiful moment. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I had something much better than a toast. I had paperwork. The moment felt too staged, too hollow, too goddamn predictable, so I let it linger for a beat or two longer, sitting still in my chair while they all floated on the manufactured high of Mom's speech. And then, when the attention began to drift just enough that their guard dropped, when forks clinked against dessert plates and the conversation began its awkward return to normalcy, I leaned forward slowly, deliberately, and placed a single manila envelope on the linen tablecloth, right in front of my mother's untouched creme brulee. She looked at it, confused at first, her eyes flicking toward mine as if to ask whether I'd just handed her a receipt or some meaningless piece of mail, and for a moment she didn't move. That moment, that precise sliver of time where she didn't know whether to be annoyed, intrigued, or dismissive, that was the moment I had been waiting for. I kept my voice calm, measured, just above a whisper, but strong enough to cut through the scattered chatter around the table. Before we go any further, I said, there's something you should probably read. Her fingers, manicured and trembling only slightly, reached for the flap and opened the envelope with the same tentative confusion you might have while opening a letter from a long-lost relative, hopeful but wary. She slid out the documents, her lips tightening the way they always did when she was about to read something she didn't write, and I watched the blood drain from her face with every line her eyes scanned. It didn't happen all at once, not dramatically or with some gasp you'd expect in a movie. Instead, it was gradual, controlled. The unraveling of a woman who had spent her life building towers out of assumptions and was now realizing that someone had quietly removed the bottom brick. She didn't finish reading, she didn't have to. She recognized the header, the legal stamp, the dates, the signature. Dad's name. My name. The phrase irrevocable transfer of property rights, printed in bold, undeniable font. She looked up at me then, for the first time all evening, really looked, not as the daughter she could ignore or manipulate or sideline, but as someone who had somehow slipped the leash and was now holding the reins. "What is this?" she asked, her voice thin, fraying at the edges. Jake leaned in to look. Laura's smile evaporated like steam from a broken kettle. "That," I replied, keeping my tone cool and level, "is the legal documentation transferring ownership of this house and the land it sits on to me, effective the day after Dad passed. He signed it while he still had full mental capacity. You remember Frank, right? His old army buddy? He notarized it himself." Jake snatched the papers from her hand, eyes darting from line to line like he could somehow find a loophole if he read fast enough, and Laura just sat there frozen, her hand still clutching the stem of her wine glass like it was the only solid thing left in the room. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. She was doing the math, I could see it. Counting backwards to the doctor's visits, the hospice nurse, the notary's visit, trying to remember where she was while her world was being rerouted behind her back. She reached across the table with a shaky hand, palm open as if demanding I hand her something invisible, maybe my guilt, maybe an apology, but I didn't move. I let her hand hang there. "You went behind my back," she said, her voice gaining volume now, snapping back into her performance mode, into the righteous fury she wore like a second skin. "You took advantage of a dying man. Your own father." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms slowly, letting the weight of her accusation land and slide off without resistance. "No," I said, my voice like a knife pressed against velvet. "I honored his wishes. He knew you'd make this into a game. He knew you'd turn his death into a throne for yourself. And he didn't want that. He chose me because he saw what you never did." The silence that followed wasn't the awkward kind anymore. It was cold. Dead. The kind of silence that only comes when something permanent has been said, when the air itself knows the room has changed. Jake tried to speak, mumbling something about fairness, about how this wasn't what Dad intended, but I cut him off before the sentence had the chance to fumble into coherence. "I don't owe you explanations," I said, and the words came easier than I expected. "Not after all the years I spent earning scraps of affection while you two were handed trophies just for showing up. Not after being told I was too serious, too distant, too much like a problem that couldn't be solved with a new outfit or a boyfriend." My mother looked older then, noticeably, painfully older, not just in her face, but in her posture, in the way her shoulders slumped and her eyes couldn't find a place to rest. I think, in that moment, she finally understood that she had built her legacy on the backs of illusions, and those illusions had just been torn down in front of the only audience that mattered to her. I stood slowly, took the pen from my purse, the same one Dad used to sign the transfer, and clicked it once, the sound loud and final in the heavy air. I placed it on the table next to the documents, then looked each of them in the eye. "If you want to toast to legacies," I said, "make sure you're not drinking on borrowed ground." Then I walked out. The drive home that night felt longer than it should have, not because of the distance, 52 miles, give or take, but because of the silence that stretched between me and Ed, thick and deliberate, not tense exactly, but heavy with a kind of electricity that can only exist when something irreversible has just happened. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes on the road ahead, saying nothing for the first 30 minutes, not out of anger, but because he understood better than anyone that what had happened back there was not some impulsive act of petty vengeance, but the result of decades' worth of quiet endurance, finally giving way to something firm, final, and necessary. And when he did speak, his voice was soft, low, measured like it always is when he's sorting through a mess I never asked him to clean. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, glancing at me briefly before turning his gaze back to the dark ribbon of asphalt winding through the trees. And I nodded, not because I was all right in the conventional sense, but because for the first time in my life, I felt like I had finally stopped waiting for permission to be seen. The house was quiet when we got home. The kids were already asleep, their shoes kicked off at odd angles near the door, a forgotten juice glass still sweating on the kitchen counter. I stood there for a moment, watching the ordinary stillness of my own home, realizing just how far removed it was from the world I had walked away from only hours earlier, a world built on theatrics and guilt and conditional love. Ed went upstairs to check on the kids while I poured myself a drink, not wine, not tonight, but something sharper, cleaner, and sat down at the kitchen table. The same one where I'd signed school permission slips and budgeted for family vacations, and once cried at 2 in the morning over a miscarriage I never told my mother about because I knew she would have somehow made it about herself. I didn't feel triumphant, not really. I didn't feel like I had won anything. What I felt was stillness. And for someone like me, someone who'd spent her entire life waiting for the next jab, the next backhanded compliment, the next reminder that I would never quite measure up to the golden boy brother or the porcelain doll sister, stillness was a new, almost terrifying relief. But it didn't last long. The fallout started before breakfast the next day. A text from Laura, long, breathless, and dripping with disbelief, landed at 6:45 in the morning. She wanted to talk privately, to make sense of things, as if what I'd done had introduced chaos into a structure that had never known balance to begin with. I didn't respond. Jake called around 9, left a voicemail where he started off calm but veered quickly into raised voices and phrases like completely blindsided and disrespectful to Dad's memory, which I found laughable coming from the same man who hadn't visited the hospital once in the final month of Dad's life because he couldn't stand seeing him that way. And Mom didn't call at all. But she didn't need to. The silence from her was louder than any of their noise. By midweek, the emails had started coming in from her lawyer, filled with impotent bluster and thinly veiled threats about contesting the transfer, about how undue influence might be proven, about how family intent could override technicality. I forwarded everything to Frank, who replied with exactly the kind of dry legal confidence I needed to hear. They have no case. Everything is clean. Let them make noise. But the part one hadn't expected, what hit me harder than any of their tantrums or accusations, was the ache that arrived on Thursday afternoon when I found myself staring out the kitchen window, watching the trees sway in the July wind, and wondering whether I had just destroyed what little chance there was of ever being anything close to a family again. Not that we ever truly were one, not in the way movies or Christmas cards want you to believe. But even the broken version of family has its own rhythm, its own gravity, and stepping out of that orbit, even when it's toxic, can leave you feeling like you're floating somewhere too quiet, too far away from something you once mistook for home. Ed saw it in me, the way he always does. He didn't press. He just brought me a folded blanket, sat down across from me, and said, "You know, you didn't break anything. It was already broken. You just stopped pretending the cracks weren't there." And he was right, of course. He usually is. But that didn't make the emptiness go away. Because the truth is, revenge, even the most justified, the most clean and papered and notarized kind, doesn't taste sweet when it's done right. It tastes like ash. Like the final breath of something you spent your whole life trying to fix until you realized it wasn't broken, it was just always ugly at the core. I heard from Frank again the next week. He called this time, not to talk legalities, but to say something personal. He told me my father had asked him to include a letter, something separate from the legal documents, something meant just for me. He'd forgotten to hand it off in the shuffle of everything else and wanted to drop it off in person. I agreed. He came by that Friday, handed me a single envelope, no return address, just my name written in my father's distinct, careful handwriting. I opened it slowly, my hands shaking in a way they hadn't even at the dinner table that night. Inside was a single page, a few short lines written in blue ink. "Rachel, I'm sorry I didn't protect you the way I should have. I saw you long before you thought I did. I just didn't know how to reach across the mess your mother made. This land, this house, it was never a gift. It's an apology. Make it yours. Make it better. Dad." I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the same drawer where I kept the deed, not because it needed to be protected, but because it felt like the closing line to a story I had been rewriting since I was a child. Weeks passed. Then months. The noise from my mother and siblings faded like static from a distant radio station. No lawsuits came. No surprise visits. Just the quiet aftermath of a family that had never really learned how to love without keeping score, finally losing the scoreboard. Sometimes I drive out to the property alone. I walk the land, listen to the wind in the trees, and try to imagine what it might have looked like if things had been different. If Mom had been capable of love that wasn't performative, if Jake had been less entitled, if Laura had ever learned to stop seeking applause for survival. But those are just fantasies. What I have now is something real, a chance to build something where their shadows no longer reach. And maybe, years from now, when my own children stand in this house, they won't inherit pain in the walls or guilt in the air. Maybe they'll inherit something better. You wanted a legacy, didn't you, Mom? Well, here it is.